6 seasons, said the woman in the primrose gown, loud enough to carry the length of the card room, and not one man has offered for her. One begins to suspect it is not misfortune at all, but a kind of talent. The laughter that followed was soft and practiced, the laughter of people who had rehearsed their cruelty until it sounded like wit. From his place near the tall windows, half in shadow, Corbett, Duke of Stonefield, watched the primrose gown turn her fan toward a woman standing alone by the refreshment table, and he understood at once that the whole performance had an audience of one. Every bob was aimed at her. Every laugh was meant to reach her ears. He did not know the woman by the table. He knew only that she did not flinch. That was the first thing he noticed, and he noticed it against his will, for the Duke of Stonefield had come to Harding Wells that evening determined to notice nothing at all. He had come because his sister had wept, and because a man could refuse his sister a great many things but not her tears, and because the assembly at Harding Wells was the sort of small, striving affair that no one of his rank ever troubled to attend. Which meant he might stand in a corner of it for 2 hours and be left in relative peace. He had calculated wrongly. A duke was never left in peace. He had felt the room bend toward him the moment he entered, the way a field of wheat bends before wind, and he had retreated to the windows and set his face into the expression that had served him for a decade, cold, remote, faintly bored, the expression that told the world he required nothing of it and would forgive it nothing either. They called him proud. He had heard the word follow him through a dozen drawing rooms, always in the same lowered voice, always with the same delicious little shiver of fear beneath it. Proud, they said, and hard and impossible to please, and they were not wrong, though they did not know why, and he had long since stopped troubling to correct them. It was easier to be feared than to be pitied. He had learned that lesson thoroughly and at great cost, and the cost had a name, though he did not permit himself to say it, even in the privacy of his own skull. 9 years ago a woman had smiled at him exactly as these people smiled at one another, and he had believed the smile, and she had taken his devotion and his good name and set them beside another man's greater fortune and found them wanting, and she had told him so on the eve of their wedding with the same soft, rehearsed laughter he was hearing now. He had not believed a smile since. He did not intend to begin tonight, and yet he was watching the woman by the table. She was not young in the way the room prized youth. He set her past the first bloom that these gatherings worshipped, past the age when a girl's whole worth was reckoned in the freshness of her face and the smallness of her waist and number of seasons still ahead of her. The primrose gown had made certain everyone understood this. 6 seasons, she had said, as though the years themselves were a verdict. The woman by the table wore a gown that had been turned and made over more than once. He could see it even from here, in the careful mending at the hem, in the way the lace at her wrists had been laundered until it was more memory than lace, and she wore it without apology, her shoulders square, her chin level, a glass of lemonade held in a hand that did not shake. Poor creature, the primrose woman went on, and now she had drawn 2 others into her orbit, a thin man with wet lips and a girl of perhaps 18 who laughed before she was told what to laugh at, though I ought not to say poor. That is precisely the difficulty, is it not? There is nothing to recommend her but her temper, and a temper is not a dowry. Augusta, murmured the thin man, in the delighted tone of a man begging a woman to be crueler. You are wicked. Augusta. The Duke fixed the name and the primrose gown together, and filed them where he filed all such people, in the cold drawer of his mind reserved for those who mistook malice for cleverness. He had known 100 Augustas. They were the ballast of every assembly in England, the women who could not shine and so contrived to dim everyone around them, and ordinarily he would have turned his shoulder to her, and let her exhaust herself, and thought no more of it before his carriage reached the turnpike. But the woman by the table had heard. Of course she had heard. It had all been arranged that she should hear, and now she set down her glass, and she looked across the little distance at Augusta Westbourne, and she smiled. It was not the smile of a woman wounded. It was not the brittle, upturned mouth of someone pretending not to bleed. It was something the Duke had no ready name for, a smile with genuine warmth in it, and something quietly amused beneath the warmth, as though she had been handed a riddle whose answer she had known for years and found, on the whole, rather sad. You are quite right, Miss Westbourne, she said, and her voice was low and clear and carried without seeming to try. A temper is not a dowry, neither I have observed, is a fortune of much use to a woman who has nothing else to spend. For a moment, no one understood. Then the thin man made a sound like a cough, and the 18-year-old's laugh escaped her before she could smother it, and Augusta Westbourne's face went the particular shade of a person who has struck at someone smaller and found her hand caught. The Duke felt his own mouth move. He arrested it, for it could betray him, but the impulse had been there, unmistakable, the first true amusement he had felt in longer than he cared to reckon. "I beg your pardon," said Augusta, very cold now. "You need not," said the woman gently. "I took none. You spoke of me, not to me, which is the surest sign a person hopes not to be answered. I have only spared you the awkwardness of my having overheard." She paused, and the amusement in her softened into something almost like pity, which was, the Duke thought, the one thing a woman like Augusta could not forgive. "And I would say, since we are being honest with one another, that a woman who has spent 6 seasons watching others counted worthier than herself learns a great deal about who is worth the counting. I have had time to consider it. You may find one day that you have not." She inclined her head, perfectly civil, perfectly composed. "It is a warm room. I find I want air." And she turned and walked toward the long doors that stood open onto the terrace, unhurried, her worn skirts whispering against the floor, and she left Augusta Westbourne standing in the wreckage of her own cleverness, with 3 people watching to see how she would recover it. The Duke did not follow. He told himself this quite firmly, standing very still at the window, while some part of him that he had believed long dead turned its face toward the open doors like a plant toward a light it had forgotten existed. "There," said a voice at his elbow, warm and exasperated and entirely unafraid of him, which narrowed its owner to precisely one person in England. "Do you see now why I made you come?" His sister had crossed the room without his noticing, which told him how thoroughly he had ceased to attend to anything but the doors. Lady Marianne Corbett was 5 years his junior, and the only living creature who spoke to him as though he were a man and not a monument, and she was looking up at him now with her dark eyes bright and her mouth pressed against a smile. "I made you come," said the Duke, "because you wept in my study until I could no longer hear myself think." "I wept," said Marianne serenely, "because you have not left Stonefield in 4 months and the servants have begun to speak of you as though you were a portrait that occasionally moves. But that is neither here nor there. You were watching her. I was watching a woman insult another woman," he said. "It is the chief occupation of these gatherings. I find it educational." "You were watching Adeline Harkness," said his sister, "and do not trouble to deny it, for you have not looked at a living soul with that expression since before I was married. Adeline Harkness." He turned the name over and found he wished to keep it. "You know her. Everyone here knows her, which is the whole cruelty of it." Marianne's voice dropped, and the amusement went out of it, and what remained was something the Duke had rarely heard from his light-hearted sister, a plain and honest anger. Her father was Sir Whitcomb Harkness, baronet, but a poor one, and poorer every year, for he had a genius for lending money to men who never repaid it and buying land that flooded. He died in the spring owing more than the estate could answer. There were 3 daughters. Adeline is the eldest. She might have married years ago. She had offers, good ones, when she was younger, and there was still a portion to be had, but her mother was ill for a long time, and the younger girls were small, and someone had to hold the household together, and she was the one who stayed. She nursed her mother to the grave, and she saw her sisters into decent marriages with what little there was, and she spent her own seasons, one after another, on everyone but herself. And now the portion is gone, and the bloom is gone, as these harpies reckon bloom, and Augusta Westbourne stands in a card room and calls it a talent for being unwanted. The Duke said nothing. He was looking at the open doors where the muslin curtains stirred in the night air, and he was thinking that he had been wrong, a moment ago, to file Augusta Westbourne away and think no more of her. He found he was thinking of her a great deal. "She lives at Comber Harkness still," Marianne went on more quietly, "or what is left of it, with an aunt and a very great deal of pride, and, I am told, almost nothing else." The house is entailed to a cousin who is waiting with a patience I can only call ghoulish for the aunt to die so that he may turn Adeline out of the only home she has ever known. He will do it too. He has said as much, and openly. She has perhaps a year. Then she will be a governess, if she is fortunate, or a companion to some dreadful old woman if she is not. His sister looked up at him. I told you she was the reason. I did not tell you it was because I could not bear that a woman like that should be ground to nothing while women like Augusta Westbourne dance. You cannot marry me to every unfortunate gentlewoman in the county to spite the fortunate ones, the Duke said, and his voice came out harder than he intended, because the thing beneath his ribs had begun to ache in a way he did not permit. I do not wish you to marry her, said Marianne, and there was something sly and knowing in it now, the sister returning to her mischief. I wished only that you should see once that not every woman in a ballroom is the one who ruined you. That is all. I have said my piece. You may go back to being a portrait. And she kissed his cheek, quick and warm, and slipped away into the crowd before he could summon a reply, leaving him alone at the window with a name he had not asked for and a distress he had not consented to feel. Across the room, Augusta Westbourne had recovered herself. He watched her do it, watched her gather her wet-lipped man and her borrowed girl and rebuild her little court, and he watched her turn her fan once more toward the terrace doors and say something behind it that made the girl laugh again. She was not finished with Adeline Harkness. He understood that with a certainty that surprised him. Women like Augusta did not forgive being answered. The exchange in the card room had not been an ending. It had been a wound, and Augusta Westbourne was the sort who nursed a wound until she could repay it tenfold and call the repayment justice. He should not care. It was no affair of his how one striving woman used another for sport. The world was made of such small cruelties, and he had trained himself not to see them, the way a man learns not to hear a clock he has lived beside for years. He had built 9 years of his life on the principle of not caring, on the clean, cold safety of a heart that asked nothing and could therefore lose nothing, and it had served him. His estates prospered. His name was feared. No woman had smiled at him and lied to him in nearly a decade, for the simple reason that he had permitted no woman close enough to try. He had thought himself content. He had believed, standing in his study 4 days ago while Marianne wept, that he had made a peace with solitude that would carry him unbroken to the grave. And then a woman in a made-over gown had set down a glass of lemonade and answered cruelty with grace, and had wanted air, and had walked out into the dark with her chin level and her worn skirts whispering, and the peace he had made was suddenly revealed to him as the thing it had always been, peace at all, but a wall and a cold one, and he standing behind it these 9 years growing old. The Duke of Stonefield looked at the open doors. He was aware of the room around him, aware that if he crossed it every eye would follow, aware that a duke who walked out onto a terrace after a penniless spinster the moment his back was turned would be the whole of the county's conversation by Sunday. He was aware of Augusta Westbourne watching the doors like a cat at a mouse-hole. He was aware, most of all, of the danger of it, not the danger to his name, which he cared nothing for, but the danger to the thing behind the wall, which he had kept safe so long by never once letting it out. He thought of the smile, not Augusta's rehearsed one, the other, the genuine weary, amused warmth of a woman who had been handed a sad riddle years ago and had chosen, against every reason, to answer it with kindness anyway. I have only spared you the awkwardness of my having overheard. He set down his own untouched glass upon the sill. He was not a man who acted upon impulse. He had not done so since he was a young fool of 29, and he had sworn he never would again. He told himself he was merely going to take the air, that the room was indeed close, that a man might walk upon a terrace on a summer night for no reason at all and answer to no one. He did not believe himself. He went anyway. And as he moved from the shadow of the window into the light, and the whole assembly turned, as he had known it would, to watch the Duke of Stonefield cross the floor with that unhurried, unstoppable stride toward the doors through which no one had thought to wonder where a poor gentlewoman had gone, as Augusta Westbourne's fan went still against her lips and her eyes narrowed with the first dawning of a suspicion that would, in time, become a war. Corbett understood that he had already lost the safe and careful battle he had been fighting for 9 years. and that he had lost it in the space of a single sentence, to a woman whose name he had learned only minutes ago, and that there would be no getting back behind the wall now. He was halfway across the floor before he understood that he had not decided to walk at all. His feet had decided for him, the way a man's hand will reach of its own accord toward a warmth after a long cold. A dowager turned to greet him and thought better of it at the sight of his face. A cluster of young men parted before him without being asked. He passed Augusta Westbourne close enough to see the powder at the corner of her tightening mouth, and he did not so much as glance at her, and he felt rather than saw the calculation begin behind her eyes. The night air met him at the threshold, cool and sweet with the smell of stocks and cut grass, and beyond the spill of candlelight the terrace lay in blue shadow, and somewhere in that shadow was Edeline Harkness, and the Duke of Stonefield, who required nothing of the world and forgave it nothing, walked out into the dark to find her. The music swelled again, a country dance struck up by the hired players in the gallery, and the assembly rooms of Malcolm closed over the moment like water over a dropped stone. Corbett, Duke of Stonefield, did not move from the shadowed pillar where he had set his shoulder. He watched the woman they had just cut to ribbons gather the loose end of her glove, smooth it as though nothing had been said at all, and lift her chin by the smallest degree, not in defiance, which the room would have relished, but in the plain composure of one who had decided long ago that she would not give them her flinch. He had seen a great many people flinch. It was, he had come to think, the truest currency of a ballroom, who could make another wince, and who could be made to. He had spent the better part of the evening being flattered by mothers who spoke to his acreage rather than his face, and he had grown skilled at the courteous nothing that turned them aside. But he had not, in all those years, seen anyone stand quite as she stood now, unhurried, unbroken, faintly amused at some private thought that had nothing to do with the whispers still circling her like gnats. "Your Grace." The voice at his elbow was honey poured over a knife. Augusta Westbourne had contrived, as she always contrived, to arrive precisely where she wished to be. She was young and handsome and knew it to the last curl, and she arranged herself before him with the confidence of a woman who had never once been refused a thing she had truly set her mind upon. "You look positively grim. I declare the country air does not agree with you. You must let me find you better company than these dull squires and their duller daughters." "I find the company instructive," he said. "Instructive?" She laughed, a bright practiced sound. "You are too generous by half. Though I suppose one must be charitable, even here." Her gaze slid across the room and fixed, with a small satisfied precision, on the woman by the window. "Poor Miss Harkness. One does pity her. Still unwed, and no longer in any position to hope. And yet she will keep coming to these things, as though a partner might drop from the chandelier. My mother says it is want of sense. I say it is want of a looking-glass." The Duke said nothing. He had learned that his silences unnerved people far more than his words, and that they filled them, obligingly, with themselves. "You need not be kind about it," Augusta pressed, mistaking the quiet for encouragement. "Everyone thinks it." She was quite passed over even in her season, and the years have not been generous. There is nothing so tiresome as a woman who has not the wit to know when she has been forgotten. "And has she not the wit?" Corbett asked. Augusta blinked. "I beg your pardon." "You said she wants sense, and then that she wants the wit to know she is forgotten. I only wondered which failing you had settled upon. They cannot both be true, and I confess I am curious which you would defend." The colour rose along her throat, quick and unbecoming. "You are teasing me, Your Grace. I would not dream of it," he said, and inclined his head, and left her standing there with her fan half raised, which was as near to open discourtesy as his rank permitted him, and rather nearer than it usually allowed. He was aware, dimly, that he had done it not for the sport of it. He took no sport in the Augusta Westbournes of the world, who were as common as rain, but because something in the easy cruelty of her had scraped a nerve he had thought long since gone to bone. He did not go directly toward the window. A man in his position could not cross a room without cost. Every step spent him drew eyes, invited interception. So he moved by degrees, pausing to exchange a word with old Sir Hollis about the state of the turnpike, admiring with grave insincerity a dowager's remarkable turban, letting the current of the room carry him the long way round until, without ever having seemed to aim for it, he found himself within a few paces of the tall window and the woman beneath it. She was not, he thought, looking at her properly for the first time, a beauty in any sense the room would credit. Augusta was the acknowledged article, all bloom and symmetry, the kind of face painters flattered and poets ruined. This woman was made of quieter materials. Her gown was 2 seasons out of the fashion and had been let down and turned to serve another year. He knew enough of such economies, though it was strange to him to recognize them, to see the neat, careful stitches where the hem had been remade. Her dark hair was dressed simply, without the aid of an expensive maid, but her face in the candlelight had a stillness in it that drew the eye the way a lit window draws the traveler on a cold road, not because it dazzles, but because it promises warmth within. She was attending to an elderly gentleman in a bath chair, an infirm creature with palsied hands who had been wheeled to the edge of the dancing and there, plainly, forgotten by whatever party had brought him. The old man was fretting at a fallen shawl. She knelt without ceremony, retrieved it, tucked it about his knees, and said something low that made his ruined face crease into a smile. She did not glance about first to see who observed her charity. That, more than anything, arrested the Duke. He had spent his life among people who did nothing that was not first weighed for its audience. He might have passed on. He had intended, insofar as he had intended anything, only to look. But the old man's failing eyes lifted to the Duke's approach, and the man's whole frame stiffened with the reflexive alarm of the humble before the great, and he began to struggle upright out of some ancient instinct of deference. Miss Harkness turned to see what had frightened him. Her eyes met the Duke's. They were grey and clear and entirely unafraid. "Please," Corbett said quickly, to the old man, "do not stir on my account. I beg you will keep your seat." And then, because the woman was watching him with a candour he was not accustomed to and could not quite account for, he added, "I fear I have alarmed your companion. That was not my intention." "You wear a great many alarming things, your grace," she said. "The title chief among them. It is not your fault. Mr. Pruett has served the great all his life and cannot be persuaded at his age that any of them wish him well." She said it lightly, without a particle of malice, and settled her hand on the old man's shoulder to still him. "There, now. His Grace bids you sit. You may believe a duke if you will not believe me." Corbett found, to his considerable surprise, that he wished to smile. He did not. His face had long since forgotten how to do such things in company, and he did not trust it to remember gracefully. But he felt the impulse of it, unfamiliar and not unwelcome, somewhere beneath his ribs. "You know me, then," he said. "Everyone in this room knows you," she answered. "You are the single most discussed article in 3 counties. I should think you cannot walk to the refreshment table without being weighed, priced, and disposed of in marriage a dozen times over before you reach the lemonade." She tilted her head, considering him with a frankness that ought to have offended him and somehow did not. It must be very tiresome to be a fortune with a man attached. He had been called many things across his 38 years. He had been feared, courted, envied, and in the low seasons of his life, pitied. He could not recall the last occasion on which anyone had spoken to him as though he was simply a person who might find a thing tiresome. The novelty of it went through him like cold water, bracing and strange. "You do not mean to weigh and price me, I take it," he said. "I have not the means to bid, your grace, and I was raised not to handle goods I cannot buy." A small wry curve touched her mouth. "Besides, you looked as though you had been valued quite enough for one evening. I thought I would spare you." "That is a great kindness," he said, and meant it more than she could know. "It is common decency. Kindness costs something. Decency costs nothing, which is why so few can be troubled with it." She glanced past him then, to where the dancing turned and shimmered, to the young women arranged along the wall like blooms in a hothouse waiting to be picked. "You will observe that I am the only person in this room who has not tried to make you dance with her tonight. I count it a mark of good breeding. My mother, God rest her, held that one should never offer a gentleman a thing he plainly does not want, and you have the look of a man who would sooner walk barefoot to the sea than stand up for a reel. You read me too easily," he said. "It is unnerving. I have had a great deal of practice at reading people, your grace. When one is not permitted to speak, one learns to watch. It is the education left to those the world has done with." She said it without bitterness, as a naturalist might remark upon the habits of a bird, and bent once more to settle Mr. Pruett's shawl. You watched too. I noticed it when you came in. You stood by the pillar an hour and let them all come to you, and you weighed each one and set them down again, and none of them saw that they had been weighed at all. We are alike in that, at least, though you do it from above and I from beneath, which makes all the difference in the world to everyone but us. She turned back to arrange the old man's shawl again where his restless hands had disturbed it, and the movement dismissed the Duke as gently and completely as if she had shown him the door. She was not being rude. She had simply finished with him, having no use for him, and had returned to the person in the room who needed her. He was not accustomed to being finished with. He was accustomed to being the sun about which the assembly ordered itself, and he stood now at the edge of her small circle of lamplight, entirely outside it, and found that he did not wish to leave. "You are Miss Harkness," he said. She glanced up. "I am. And I am aware, Your Grace, that you have lately been told a great deal about me by Miss Westbourne, none of it flattering and most of it true. I am Unwood. I am past the age at which the fact can be called anything but a settled condition. I have no fortune, no connections worth the naming, and a gown you have already noticed has been turned." She said it without heat, without the smallest tremor of self-pity, laying each hard fact before him like a hand of cards played face up. "I tell you plainly so that you need not trouble to discover it and be disappointed. It saves us both the dance of it." He was silent a moment. The music turned over behind him. Somewhere a girl laughed too loudly at a joke that had not been funny. "You assume I collect disappointments," he said. "I assume you collect nothing at all," she returned, "and that you are only being civil to an old man because you are, whatever the county says of you, better than they give you credit for. But I have learned that when the great are kind, it is wise to enjoy it quickly and expect nothing after. It spares the heart." For the first time, something crossed her face that was not composure, a shadow, gone as soon as seen, of a wound she had dressed a very long time ago and no longer showed to anyone. "Forgive me. That was more than you asked." "It was exactly what I asked," he said. "I find I would rather be told the truth abruptly than flattered at length. You would be astonished how seldom I am offered the choice." She studied him then, truly studied him, as though revising some settled judgment. It was not the assessing look the mothers gave him, cataloguing his coat and his consequence. It was the look of one person trying honestly to see another, and it made him aware of himself in a way he had not been in years, not of his rank, which was armor he had long since stopped feeling, but of the man inside it, unregarded and unknown. "No," she said slowly. "No, I do not suppose you are offered it often. Everyone wants something of a duke. It must be a lonely thing to be wanted so much and known so little." She caught herself, and a faint color rose in her cheek, the first she had shown. "There I go again. My aunt says my tongue will see me buried in a pauper's field, and she is very likely right." "Your aunt," he said, "has plainly never been made to endure an entire assembly of people who agree with her. It is a rare tonic disagreement. I begin to see why you are so little valued here. You are inconvenient." "I am the most inconvenient woman in Malcombe," she agreed gravely. "It is the one distinction left to me, and I hold it very dear." And the Duke of Stonefield, who had not laughed aloud in company in longer than he cared to reckon, who had schooled his face to marble a decade of guarding a heart that had once been handed, whole and trusting to a woman who had weighed his title and found the man beside it superfluous, felt the thing break loose in his chest before he could stop it. It was not a large laugh. It was low and short and rusty at the hinges. But it was real, and it turned heads across the room. He saw the ripple of it go out from where he stood, saw Fan's pause and eyes cut sideways, saw Augusta Westbourne's bright face across the floor go suddenly coldly still. Miss Harkness heard it too, and looked genuinely startled, as though she had not intended to produce any such effect and was not certain she approved of it. "I have made a spectacle of us," she said. "You must go and be a duke again quickly, before they decide I have bewitched you. They will forgive you anything but that. Let them decide what they please," he said, and was mildly astonished to hear himself say it. It was not a thing he said. His whole life had been an exercise in the management of what people decided. Old Mr. Pruett stirred in his chair and murmured her name, querulous and lost, and she bent to him at once, and the moment folded shut. I must take him into his people, she said, straightening. He tires and grows frightened when the rooms are loud, and there is no one else who will trouble to notice. She dropped the smallest curtsy, correct, unhurried, owing him nothing beyond its form. It was more than I looked for this evening, to be spoken to as though I were a person. I shall keep it. Good night, Your Grace. She took the handles of the bath chair herself, this woman in her turned gown whom the county had priced at nothing, and wheeled the old man toward the far doors, pausing to murmur to him, bending her head to catch his failing words. Moving through the glittering crowd that parted for her not out of respect, but out of the instinct that keeps the fine from brushing the plain. No one helped her. No one marked her going save the one man in the room whom everyone marked. Corbett stood where she had left him, at the edge of a circle of lamplight that had gathered itself and departed, and did not go and be a duke again. Across the floor he was aware of Augusta rearranging her face into welcome, of the mothers gathering their daughters for another sortie, of the whole vast machinery of the evening turning once more toward him now that he stood alone and available. He heard none of it. He watched the doors where a woman had gone out carrying an old man's shawl, and his own settled understanding of the world, both of them tucked away as though they weighed nothing at all. She had asked him for nothing. In a room built entirely of people asking, she had stood before the largest fortune in 3 counties and asked him for nothing but the truth, and had given him hers without being asked, and had walked away the moment her presence was needed elsewhere. He turned the fact over and could make it come out no other way, and he did not know what to do with it, only that he could not, for the life of him, take his eyes from the door through which she had disappeared. Nor quiet the single unaccustomed thought now turning in him like a key long stiff in its lock, that he had come to Malcolm to be bored and endured, and gone home unchanged, and that something against every guard he had set, just refused to let him. The music changed, and with it the whole room seemed to lean, the way a field of barley leans when the wind decides its direction. Corbett stood near the tall windows at the north end of the assembly hall, a glass of untouched claret warming in his hand, and told himself he was watching the country dancers form their sets. It was not true. He was watching one woman cross the floor, and he had been watching her, in one fashion or another, for the better part of an hour, and he could not for his life have said why a man who had schooled himself so thoroughly against wanting anything should find his gaze pulled back again and again to Adeline Harkness. She had come to the edge of the candlelight where the older women sat, the matrons and the mothers with marriageable daughters, and she was helping the eldest Mrs. Fay adjust the shawl that had slipped from her shoulders. It was a small thing, done without display, and no one but Corbett appeared to notice it. That, he thought, was the whole of the woman in a single gesture. She did the kind thing when the kind thing was invisible. Then Augusta Westbourne rose from among the seated ladies, and the temperature of the room dropped by some measure. Corbett felt in his spine before he understood it. Augusta was beautiful in the way a well-set diamond is beautiful, hard and cut for effect and cold to the touch. She had entered the season as its acknowledged queen, and she had spent the past 3 weeks making certain that everyone in the county understood the office to be hers by right. She wore silver tonight, and she wore it as a challenge. Around her gathered the 2 Mrs. Crane and young Lord Petheridge, who laughed at what Augusta wished laughed at, and it was toward Adeline that all 4 of them now turned, with the leisurely cruelty of people who have found their sport for the evening. "Miss Harkness," Augusta said, and her voice carried, pitched with exactness to reach the seated matrons and the standing gentlemen both. "How good of you to come and keep the older ladies company. It is a charity truly. One does not like to think of the chaperone's bench going unattended." "It is no charity, Miss Westbourne," Adeline answered. "I like the company there better than most." A titter ran through the Cranes. Augusta smiled as though a point had been scored for her rather than against. "Of course you do. It is where you are most at home." "And how many seasons is it now?" She let the question hang, tapping her closed fan against her palm. "One loses count. You were coming out, I think, when I was still in the schoolroom, and here we both are, and one of us has learned to dance." Corbett's hand tightened on the glass. He knew this game. He had watched it played 100 times in 100 rooms, and he had never once cared enough to interrupt it. because the objects of it had always been, to his cold assessment, either deserving or dull. He set the claret down on the sill. "They say," put in one of the Mrs. Crane, emboldened, "that Miss Harkness has quite given up hoping, that she means to keep house for her uncle until he has no further use for her, and then—" The girl gestured vaguely, as if the rest were too dreadful to name. "How economical," Augusta murmured. "A woman who costs nothing and expects nothing. Every household should have one. Tell me, Miss Harkness." And here she came a half-step closer, and her voice softened into something worse than mockery, into pity worn like a jewel. "Does it not weary you to stand at the edge of every room, season upon season, in the same two gowns turned and turned again, watching younger women be chosen? I ask only out of kindness. I should find it unendurable." The room had gone quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet, when everyone is pretending not to listen. Adeline stood very straight. She was not dressed as the others were dressed. Corbett had marked that from the first, the plain sprigged muslin, the single string of modest pearls, the gloves that had been mended at one seam with a care that had almost hidden the mending. She had nothing in that room but herself, and she stood in it as though herself were enough. "You are kind to trouble yourself over my weariness, Miss Westbourne," she said, and her voice was quite steady and quite warm, and somehow the warmth of it was the sharpest thing in the room. "But I confess I do not find the edge of a room so terrible a place to stand. One sees a great deal from the edge. One learns to tell, for instance, which smiles are meant and which are only worn. It is an education a woman gets nowhere else. I would not trade it, even for a partner in every dance." She paused, and then she added gently, as though offering a gift rather than a blow, "I hope you will never have cause to learn it yourself. It is a hard schooling, but it does leave one wonderfully hard to deceive." For a moment no one spoke. Then a single laugh broke from somewhere behind Corbett, quickly stifled, and he saw the colour climb Augusta Westbourne's white throat, and he understood that the woman in the mended gloves had won, cleanly and without malice, and that Augusta knew it. It was the not knowing what to do next that undid her. She had expected tears, or a stammered defence, or the flustered silence of the cornered. She had not expected to be answered by someone entirely unafraid of her. Corbett found that he had crossed half the floor without deciding to. He had meant, if he had meant anything, merely to put himself between the thing and its object, to break the moment with the weight of his rank the way one breaks a fever with cold water. He was the Duke of Stonefield. A room reordered itself around him whether he willed it or not. But as the faces turned to him, and Augusta's expression shifted, with an ugly quickness from wounded to welcoming, from victim to hostess of his attention, he heard himself speak, and the words were not the cool dismissal he had intended. "Miss Harkness," he said, "I believe the next is a country dance. I have not danced this evening. Will you give it to me?" The silence that followed the first silence was of a wholly different quality. Augusta Westbourne's fan stopped against her palm. Lord Petheridge's mouth came open and stayed so. Corbett was aware of all of it, the ripple going outward through the room, gentleman turning to lady, lady leaning to lady, the name Stonefield passing from lip to lip like a struck bell. The Duke who danced with no one, who had refused the season's acknowledged beauty not a week past, standing now with his hand extended to the woman at the chaperone's bench in her turned muslin and her mended gloves. He was aware, too, that he had surprised himself far more than he had surprised any of them. Adeline did not take his hand at once. That, more than anything else in the strange evening, arrested him. Any other woman in the county would have had her fingers in his before he finished the sentence. Augusta would have taken his hand as a queen accepts tribute. This one looked at him, actually looked up into his face with a pair of steady grey eyes that held neither triumph nor calculation nor the fluttering gratitude he had braced himself against, and what he saw in them was something perilously close to worriness. "You need not, Your Grace," she said quietly, so quietly it did not carry beyond the two of them. "I am not drowning. I promise you I am not. You need not lend me your consequence to save me from Miss Westbourne. I have weathered worse than her, and on nights when no Duke was near to trouble himself, he had come to rescue her, and she had, without raising her voice, declined to be rescued. No one had refused Corbett anything in a very long time. He discovered that he did not know where to put the feeling it gave him, which was not offence, as it ought to have been, but something warmer and far more dangerous, something that felt absurdly like relief. I am aware you are not drowning, Miss Harkness, he said. I watched you decline to drown very thoroughly. That is not why I am asking. Then why? The honest question, put plainly, with no coquetry laid under it. He was so unused to being asked anything honestly that for a heartbeat he had no answer ready, and the truth arrived before any polished thing could take its place. Because I find, he said, that I should like to go on talking to you, and one cannot stand at the chaperone's bench and do it without 100 people supposing things. On the floor we shall at least be given the courtesy of being watched from a distance. Something moved across her face then, quick and gone, not the calculation he half expected, the swift reckoning of advantage that he had learned, years ago, and at bitter cost, to watch for in every fair face turned up to his. There had been such a face once, long ago. Upturned and lovely and full of a warmth he had believed in utterly, and it had wanted Stonefield and its rents and its ancient name, and had wanted the man who held them not at all, and the discovering of it had cost him something he had never troubled to replace. He had built his reserve on that ground stone by stone and had lived behind it so long he no longer felt the walls. He felt them now. He felt them oddly, as one feels a coat grown too tight. She put her hand in his. It was as a small hand, and through the worn kid of her glove he could feel the mend at the seam, a faint ridge against his palm, and he thought, with a violence of feeling that alarmed him, that he would sooner hold this mended glove than all the silk in the county. He led her onto the floor. The other couples arranged themselves with an unnatural care, keeping a half-pace more distance than the figure required, the better to see. Corbett ignored them with the ease of long practice. Adeline, he saw, did not ignore them. She simply declined to be governed by them, which was a different and rarer thing. The music began. The country dance is a merciless invention for conversation, forever parting the partners and returning them, so that a sentence must be built across a dozen crossings. But Corbett found he did not mind it. It gave him her return to look forward to at the end of every figure. You did not deny it, he said, when the dance brought them together down the line. What Miss Westbourne said, the seasons, the bench. Why should I deny the truth? They parted. She went down the outside and came back unhurried. I am unwed and past the age when the county has decided a woman ought to be settled, and I have stood at the edge of a good many rooms. Denying it would only have given her a second thing to laugh at, the lie, and then the laughing at the lie. Most would have wept. Weeping is what she came for. I did not care to give her the meal she had dressed for. A crossing separated them. When she came back her mouth had curved, very slightly at one corner. That sounds harder than I am, your grace. I do not enjoy it. I would a great deal rather she were kind. But since she has decided to be otherwise, I find it costs me less to be amused than to be wounded, and a woman in my position must be careful of her expenses. He nearly laughed. He who was reputed through 3 counties to have forgotten how. And what is your position, Miss Harkness, that you must count so close? You know it, your grace. Everyone here knows it. Miss Westbourne was good enough to publish it. My father was a clergyman with more books than living, and he died with the books unpaid for. I keep house for my uncle, who is not unkind but is not warm, and who reminds me of my keep the way other men remind themselves of the weather. I have no fortune, no beauty that stops a room, and no expectation of either. She said it without a scrap of self-pity, as another woman might recite the contents of a shopping list. There, now you have it entire, and needn't wonder. I have always thought it kinder to tell a person straight, so they may decide at once whether I am worth the trouble of knowing. The figure took her from him again. Corbett stood in his place with his heart doing something wholly unfamiliar and vaguely mutinous inside his chest. And he thought that he had sat across dinner tables from women who spent 2 hours and a great deal of art contriving to seem mysterious, and here was one who had laid her whole circumstance before him in the turning of a dance, plainly, as though it cost nothing, and had thereby made herself the most unfathomable creature he had met in a decade. And have you decided, he asked when she came back, whether I am worth the trouble of knowing? He had not meant to ask it. It was the sort of question he never asked, because the answer was never in doubt. He was the Duke of Stonefield, and the whole apparatus of the county existed to assure him hourly that he was worth any trouble at all. He asked it now, and for the first time he could remember, did not know what would be said. Adeline considered him. They had come to a pause in the figure, the two of them standing while the head couple worked down the set, and she used the moment to look at him properly, gravely, as though he were a page she meant to read with care and not merely admire the binding of. "I have not decided," she said at last. "You will forgive me, but I have known dukes only by report until this evening, and the report was not encouraging. They said you were cold. They said you had refused Miss Westbourne without so much as a civil word, and half the ballrooms in England before her. They said your heart was somewhere north with your dogs and your account books and had not been seen in company for years." She tilted her head. "And then you crossed a room you had no reason to cross, to a woman who could do nothing for you, and asked her to dance in front of everyone who matters to your name. So I find the report and the man do not agree, and until they do I am reserving my judgment. I hope that does not offend you." "I should think it a poor sort of judgment that came cheap." "It does not offend me," he said. His voice was not quite as he wished it. "It is the first honest account of myself I have been given in longer than I can tell you. They are all wrong, of course. About the heart being north with the dogs. It is a good deal nearer than that, and a good deal less well governed, and I begin to think it has been very ill served by its owner." The music was drawing toward its close. He was aware of it the way a man on a scaffold is aware of the drop, with a reluctance that shamed him. When the last figure returned her to him and he bowed and she curtsied, the whole enormous room seemed to press in to reclaim them, the watching faces, the whispering fans, Augusta Westbourne's cold bright stare fixed on them from across the floor, like a wound that had not yet decided to bleed. "Thank you, Miss Harkness," he said, and not release her hand as promptly as the form required. "You will think me a strange man. I have talked more in this one dance than in the whole of the season, and I find I am not near done, and I have not the smallest notion how a man in my position asks for more of an evening without the whole county writing the bounds before we have exchanged a third civil word." "You might try asking plainly," she said. "You seem, when you forget to be a duke, to do it rather well." She gave him the smallest of smiles and drew her mended glove from his hand and went back to the bench among the older women where the light was poor and no one else was looking. And Corbett stood in the middle of the floor of the assembly he had come to only from obligation, feeling the walls he had lived behind for 7 years shift on their foundations, and understood, with something close to alarm, that the only thing in England he now wanted was to cross that room again. He should have returned to the card room. That was where a man of his standing was expected to be found, among the men who spoke of hounds and enclosures and the price of wheat, and where the wanting of a thing could be safely drowned in claret. Instead, Corbett found himself lingering at the tall glazed doors that gave onto the terrace, watching Adeline Harkness slip out of the assembly's heat and light, as though the crowded room had grown too small to hold her, and he did the thing he had told himself upstairs he would not do. He followed her. The night air met him cool and green after the close press of candle smoke and perfume. Below the terrace the ground fell away in shallow steps to a formal garden gone silver under a 3/4 moon, box hedges clipped into low walls, gravel paths pale as bone between them. She had not gone far. She stood at the stone balustrade with her back to the house, her gloved hands resting on the cold rail, her head lifted to a sky that in that hour was more generous than anyone inside had been to her. He might have spoken at once. He did not. For a moment he only looked, and let himself feel, without argument, how much he had wanted to be exactly here. "You will take a chill," he said at last, because a man must say something, and that was safer than the truer things crowding his throat. She did not startle, which he noted and admired. She turned only her head, and the moonlight found the plain line of her jaw, the unpowdered honesty of her face. "Your Grace concerns himself with my constitution," she said. "That is more than most in that room have troubled to do this evening. Though I confess the cold is the kindest company I have kept all night, then I am sorry to intrude upon so agreeable a solitude." "You are not sorry at all," she said, and there was no impertinence in it, only a clear-eyed amusement that undid him more thoroughly than flattery ever had. "You are a man accustomed to going where he pleases, and you have decided it pleases you to stand upon this terrace. I would not dream of contradicting a duke on the matter of his own pleasure." He came down the 2 steps to the balustrade and stood a careful arm's length from her, both of them facing the garden rather than each other, as though the box hedges required their study. You say what you think, he observed. It is a habit that has cost you tonight. It has cost me every night of my life, Your Grace. I found long ago that it was cheaper than the alternative. She turned the words over as she said them, unhurried. A woman in my position may purchase the good opinion of a room by agreeing with everything said in it, and by laughing where she is meant to laugh, and by pretending that the cruelty aimed at her is a kind of which she is too dull to feel. I have watched others buy it. Price is one's whole self paid in small coins, until there is nothing left in the purse. I decided I would rather keep the self and go without the good opinion. Corbett was silent. He was thinking of a drawing room 15 years gone. Of a woman with amber eyes who had agreed with everything he said, who had laughed exactly where she was meant to laugh, and who had wept the most convincing tears he had ever seen on the morning it was discovered that her affection had been surveyed and costed like the acreage of an estate. His estate, down to the last farthing. He had believed her. That was the wound of it, the part he had never confessed to any living soul. Not that she had schemed, but that he, who prided himself on seeing through men, had believed her utterly. He had been made guarded not by her falseness, but by his own blindness, and he had sworn he would never again mistake a performance for a heart. He looked at the woman beside him, who performed nothing, who had just told him plainly that she had chosen poverty of reputation over falseness of self, and he felt something in his chest turn over that he had thought long since seized shut. They called you a spinster tonight, he said. Augusta Westbourne, before the whole assembly, she said it as one might announce a diagnosis. She did. Edeline's mouth curved, rueful, and she was quite correct. I am unmarried, and no longer young enough for the fact to be attributed to my being spoken for elsewhere. There is no gentler word for it, and I have stopped flinching from the true one. It is a strange freedom, Your Grace, to be exactly the thing the world most pities and to discover you are not, in fact, dying of it. And yet you do not marry. He heard the question under it and did not soften it. A woman of your understanding, your wit, it cannot be for want of being asked. For the first time she was quiet a long moment, and he thought he had trespassed, and was surprised by how sharply he minded the possibility. When she spoke her voice had lost none of its steadiness, but it had gained a weight, as of a thing set down carefully because it was heavier than it appeared. I was asked once, she said, when I was 19 and my father yet lived and there was a dowry, or the promise of one. Mr. Hartle was his name, a curate with a good living in prospect and a mother who counted the linen. He was not unkind. I might have been comfortable. She traced a fingertip along the cold stone rail. Then my father was thrown from his horse on the Ambrose Road and lingered a fortnight and died, and it was found that the estate died with him, that what we had called our own was mortgaged to the beams and belonged, in the end, to other men. Dowry went. The good living, it transpired, had always been rather more attached to the dowry than to me. Mr. Hartle's mother counted the linen once more, and found the sum wanting, and I received a very correct letter regretting that circumstances no longer permitted. He released you for the loss of a fortune he had pretended not to court. He released me for the loss of a fortune he had never for one moment ceased to court, she corrected gently. I do not tell it for your pity, Your Grace. I have none of my own left to spare for that girl, and I would not have you spend yours. I tell it because you asked me honestly why I do not marry, and you deserve an honest answer, which is this. I learned at 19 precisely what I am worth in the market where such things are traded, and it is not enough. So I stopped bringing myself to market. I keep my great-aunt's house instead. I read her the newspapers and win at piquet and let her scold me for my bonnets. And when she is gone the house goes to a cousin and I shall be a governess, or a companion, or whatever a woman becomes when the world has finished with her. It is not the life I would have drawn. But it is mine, and no man's letter can regret me out of it. She said it without a tremor, and it was the absence of the tremor that nearly broke him. He had sat across from earls who had wept over lesser losses. He had watched grown men of great estate rail against fortune because a favoured horse had gone lame, or a wager gone against them, or a younger brother had married better than they. He had comforted, in his cold formal way, women whose grief had been chiefly for their carriages, And he had learned to distrust the whole gaudy theatre of feeling, because he had once been its most credulous spectator. Here was a woman who had lost her father, her fortune, her betrothed, and the whole shape of the life she had imagined, and who spoke of it as one speaks of weather long past, without self-pity, without complaint, offering it to him not as a claim upon his sympathy but as a coin of pure honesty, the rarest thing he had held in 15 years. "You are wrong about one thing," he said. His voice had gone lower than he intended. I am so seldom told so. Pray enlighten me." "Your worth." He turned then, fully, so that he was looking at her and not at the garden, and the moon was behind him so that his own face was in shadow while hers was lit, and he was glad of it, for he did not trust his face. "You were valued by a boy who could not tell a woman from an entry in a ledger. That is not a measure of you. That is a measure of him. A man who lets go of a heart, because a fortune has slipped from beside it, never held the heart at all. He held the fortune and mistook the two, and the mistake was his, and he is the poorer for it every day of his life, whether he has the wit to know it or not." She was very still. The amusement had gone out of her, and something more careful had come into its place, a wariness he recognized because he wore it himself, the look of a person who has learned not to trust the warmth of a fire, because they remember too well the cold that follows when it dies. "Your Grace speaks with great feeling," she said slowly, "for a man reputed to have none. I am reputed a great many things." He was aware of how near they stood. He had not meant to close the distance and could not have said which of them had. Close enough that he could see the pulse move at her throat, the faint clouding of her breath in the cold, the way a loosened strand of hair lay against her cheek where the pins had failed it. Cold, proud, unfeeling. I have found it convenient to be thought so. A man who is believed to have no heart is not obliged to guard one. He paused. "I begin to think the belief has cost me more than it has spared me." "Then we are alike in that," she murmured. "We have each of us paid too dear for our defenses." He raised his hand. He did not decide to. His hand simply rose of its own volition, and the backs of his gloved fingers came to rest against that loosened strand of hair, and he tucked it, with a gentleness that astonished him, back from her cheek. His fingers grazed the curve of her jaw in passing, glove against bare skin, the barest contact, and it went through him like the toll of a great bell struck once in a silent church. She did not draw back. She let her eyes close for the length of a single breath, and when they opened they held his, and neither of them moved, and the whole shrieking assembly behind the glass might have fallen into the sea for all it existed in that moment. "You should not," she whispered. "No," he agreed. "I should not." He did not lower his hand. "I have nothing, Your Grace. You understand that. No name that signifies, no fortune, no connection that could do you the smallest good. Whatever this is, it can lead nowhere that would not do you harm and me worse. In an hour you will remember who you are, and I shall remember who I am not, and this terrace will be a folly we were both too cold and too foolish to resist. Let it be that, and let us go in before it becomes a thing we cannot mend." Every word she spoke was sense, and he hated every word of it, and he understood in that moment with a clarity that frightened him that he did not want the sense. He wanted her. Not her dowry, for she had none, not her name, for it was nothing, not the good opinion of the room which she had cost him rather than gained. He wanted the woman who had told him the truth in a garden when a lie would have served her better, and he had wanted nothing so honestly in 15 guarded years. "And if I told you," he said, very quietly, "that I do not remember, at this moment, being able to summon the smallest interest in who I am, then I would say Your Grace has had too much of Lady Markolt's claret, and I would say it kindly." But her voice shook on the last word, the first tremor he had heard in her all night, and it undid the last of him to know that it was he who had put it there. He let his hand fall, because to keep it there another moment was to cross a line beyond which he could not answer for himself, and because he found, to his own surprise, that he wished to deserve her rather than merely to take what the night offered. He stepped back the half-pace that decency required and felt the cold rush into the space between them like water into a breached hull. "Then I shall be a gentleman," he said, "and escort you in, and torment myself with the memory instead. But hear me, Miss Harkness, for I shall say it plainly and only once, in a garden where no one may report it. You are not a folly. Whatever the world has told you of your worth, It has lied to you as thoroughly as your curate did, and for the same small reason, because it cannot count what it does not understand. I understand it. I have looked for it in every ballroom in 3 counties and never once found it until tonight, and I do not intend to lose it because a boy 15 years my inferior taught you to expect a letter of regret. She stared at him, and for once, gloriously, she had no reply. He had silenced the quickest tongue in the county, and he found he was absurdly proud of it, and that pride was itself a kind of confession he had not known he was capable of making. They went in. He offered his arm and she took it, her gloved hand light upon his sleeve, and they crossed the terrace together toward the blazing doors, and just before they reached the light she said, so low he almost missed it, "You are a dangerous man, your grace. I had been warned of it." I had not understood the danger was of this particular kind. He might have answered. He never had the chance. As they stepped back into the heat and noise of the assembly, he felt her hand go rigid on his arm, and he followed the line of her sudden stillness across the crowded room to where Augusta Westbourne stood beneath the great chandelier with 2 of her intimates, and Augusta was not looking at the dancers, nor at the musicians, nor at any of the 100 things a lady might properly regard. She was looking at the terrace doors. She was looking at the 2 of them, at his arm and her hand upon it, and the smile that spread slowly across that handsome, discontented face was not the smile of a woman surprised. It was the smile of a woman who has been watching and waiting, and has just been handed precisely the weapon she has spent the whole evening hoping the night would yield. Corbett felt Adeline's hand begin to slip from his arm, felt her instinct to put distance between them before the distance could be remarked, and he understood the wisdom of it and would not permit it. He closed his other hand briefly over hers, holding it where it was, 1 heartbeat too long, in full view of the room and of Augusta Westbourne's patient, calculating eyes. "Let her look," he murmured, "for Adeline alone. She has spent her life mistaking cruelty for cleverness. Let us not, tonight, mistake her for someone whose looking signifies." But even as he said it, even as he felt the small warmth of Adeline's fingers steady under his, he saw Augusta lean and speak low into the ear of the woman beside her, saw that woman's gaze sharpen and travel to the pair of them, saw the whisper begin its journey mouth to ear to mouth, the way such things always began, and he knew with the cold certainty of a man who has been ruined once by exactly such a whisper that the garden had not been the end of anything. It had been the beginning. He had walked out onto that guarding a heart he had believed beyond wounding, and he had walked back in having wagered it, publicly, before the one person in the county most eager to see what it would cost him to lose. The rain came in the night and Corbett did not sleep through it. He stood at the tall window of the east chamber long after the house had gone quiet, watching the storm bend the beeches along the avenue, and he found that he could not summon a single practical thought to fill his head. There ought to have been letters to answer, an estate to weigh, the 100 small governances of Stonefield that had for years stood between him and the danger of feeling anything at all. Instead, there was only the memory of her voice in the failing light, telling him without a shred of self-pity how little the world had left her, and how much she had chosen to keep of herself regardless. He had meant, when he rode out that evening, to be careful. He was always careful. And yet he had come back a man undone, and he knew it, and the knowing frightened him more than any charge of cavalry ever had. He had told himself, riding home, that he would let a day pass before he saw her again. A day, to prove to himself that this was not the giddiness of a green boy, but the settled judgment of a grown man who had learned to distrust his own wanting. He had told himself that and had not believed a word of it, for the truth was that he had already begun, in the private country of his own mind, to arrange the impossible. He had begun to think what the county would say, and to find that he did not care what the county would say. He had begun to think of his mother's portrait in the long gallery and to wonder, for the first time in 17 years, whether the woman who hung beside it one day might be someone he had actually chosen rather than someone chosen for him. These were dangerous thoughts for a careful man, and he had let himself think them, and that was how far she had already brought him by the time the storm blew itself out. He was still at the window when the first grey of morning thinned the rain, and it was into that unguarded hour that the trouble first put its hand upon the door. His steward, Mr. Pruett, came to him before the breakfast things were cleared, and there was a stiffness in the man's bearing that Corbett had learned to read across 12 years of service. Pruett did not fidget without cause. He stood with a folded paper held at the very edge of his fingers, as though it might scald him, and he said that Lady Westbourne had sent it round by her own footman at first light, with word that his Grace would wish to see it before the morning was out, and before the county did. Corbett took the paper and felt the fine expensive weight of it, and something cold moved through him even before he had broken the seal. He had spent a lifetime among people who sent papers before breakfast. Nothing kind ever travelled that early. He read it standing. He read it a second time seated, because the first reading had gone through him like a blade and left no sense behind it, only the wound. It was a letter, or rather a copy of a letter, transcribed in a clerkly hand with a note beneath in Augusta Westbourne's own unmistakable slant, all flourishes and false regret. The original, Augusta wrote, had come into her keeping by the merest chance, and she would not for the world have troubled his Grace with a servant's spite, save that his Grace's own honour was so tenderly concerned that silence would have been a cruelty. She assured him, his most devoted and grieving friend. The letter itself purported to be from Edeline. It was addressed to a woman named only as Dearest Sarah, and it spoke in warm and confiding terms of a campaign. It spoke of the Duke of Stonefield as a fortress that a clever woman might yet take if she were patient and did not overplay her hand. It spoke of poverty as a costume to be worn becomingly, of humility as the surest lure for a proud man weary of flattery, of the great good fortune that Stonefield's master should prove so hungry for the appearance of sincerity that a little of it, well managed, might purchase a duchess's coronet. "Do not pity me, my plain gowns," the letter said. "They have done more for my cause than all Augusta Westbourne's silks have done for hers. He is more than half caught already. A month, and I shall have him, and then let them sneer who sneered." Corbett set the paper down upon the table with a care that cost him everything he had. For a long moment he did not move at all. The clock on the mantel ticked. Somewhere below, a maid was singing unaware, and in the silence the old wound, the one he had thought long healed over, split clean open as though the years had never passed, and he was 22 again and standing in a colder room than this, holding another letter, learning in one afternoon that the woman he had meant to marry had wanted Stonefield and never once wanted him. He had read that letter, too, in another woman's clever hand. He had believed himself beloved and been shown in ink that he was only a fortune with a face. He had built his whole guarded life upon the vow that no one should ever make such a fool of him again, that he would trust the appearance of nothing, that he would keep the world at the length of his own cold arm and be safe there, be alone there, be at least never again that boy staring at a page while his heart came apart. And here was the page again. Here was the very same treachery in a new hand, and it named the very fear he had confessed to no living soul. That was the poison in it, and Augusta had brewed it well. It was not merely that the letter accused Edeline. It was that it accused her of precisely the thing he had spent 17 years teaching himself to expect from every gentle voice and every downcast eye. It spoke his own buried dread aloud and dressed it in Edeline's supposed hand, so that every tender thing she had ever said to him was made, in an instant, to curdle. Her honesty, that had struck him as the first honest thing he had met in a decade, became a performance so accomplished that it had deceived even him. The plain gowns he had thought her too proud to be ashamed of became a strategy. The evening in the garden, her voice in the dusk, the near touch of her hand that he had not permitted himself, and had regretted not permitting all through the sleepless night, all of it turned in his memory to something staged for his ruin. He was ashamed, afterward, of how long the poison held him. It was not a moment. He would have liked to say it was a moment, a single stumble a stronger man would not have made. But he sat with that letter for the better part of an hour, and in that hour he was not the Duke of Stonefield, feared across 3 counties, master of himself before all men. He was a wounded creature retreating into the only shelter it had ever known, which was the belief that everyone lied and only a fool forgot it. He thought of how easily he had been caught. He thought that a woman clever enough to seem that sincere would be clever enough to write a letter that seemed that damning by accident, and then he thought, with self-contempt, that this was exactly the reasoning of a man who wished to keep his wound and call it wisdom. Pruett had withdrawn. Corbett rose at last and went again to the window, and the rain had stopped, and the county was going about its business under a scrubbed pale sky, and none of it helped him at all. He did what he had always done when his heart was in danger. He looked for the cold, ordering hand of fact, and he made himself hold the letter up against everything he actually knew, rather than everything he feared. And the facts, when he forced himself to number them, would not lie down as neatly as the poison wished. He knew Adeline's hand. He had seen it but once, a note of thanks she had written on behalf of the elderly lady she served, Mrs. Fenn, whose companion and reader and general comfort she had been these 3 years for a wage that would have shamed a scullery. He had kept that note, though he would not have admitted to keeping it, and he found it now in the drawer of the writing table where he had put it, and he laid the 2 papers side by side. The clerkly copy told him nothing, of course, for a copy is in the copyist's hand. But Augusta had been too pleased with her own cleverness to send only a copy. Folded within, meant no doubt to be produced at the crushing moment before witnesses, was a scrap she claimed to be the original's final leaf, a few lines and a signature, Adeline Harkness, entire and flourished. And it was wrong. He saw it the way a man sees that a familiar face has been subtly rearranged in a dream. Adeline wrote a small, level, economical hand, the hand of a woman who'd never in her life owned paper to waste. This signature sprawled. It flourished. It had a duchess's confidence in it, and Adeline, who had every true nobility, had never once in his sight carried herself with the smallest particle of that particular vanity. Whoever had forged it had drawn the woman the world believed her to be, the scheming spinster of Augusta's fond invention, and not the woman herself at all. The relief of it went through him so hard that he had to sit down again, and hard upon the relief came a shame far worse than the first, for he understood that he had needed the proof. A better man, a braver one, would have flung the letter in Pruett's fire the instant he read the tenderness in the garden made into strategy, would have trusted the living woman over the dead page. He had not. He had wavered. He had let a scrap of paper set his heart against her for the better part of an hour, because a scrap of paper had done it once before, and he had never forgiven the world for it. Adeline had given him her truth in the dusk with nothing to gain and everything to lose, and he had paid her for it, in the privacy of his own soul, with an hour of doubt. He was reaching for his coat, meaning to ride to Mrs. Fenn's house that very moment and undo whatever could be undone, when Pruett returned with a face graver still, and told him that his Grace was too late to do it quietly. Lady Westbourne, it seemed, had not waited upon his Grace's answer. The letter had gone round the county with the milk. It had been read aloud, Pruett said with distaste, in Mrs. Ashcombe's morning room to a gathering of ladies. And by noon there would not be a drawing-room in the neighbourhood that had not heard how the Fenn woman's poor companion had schemed to trap the Duke of Stonefield for his fortune, and had been caught out of her own pen. And there was worse. Mrs. Fenn, an old woman easily frightened and long dependent on Augusta Westbourne's brother for the small annuity that kept her roof whole, had that morning dismissed Adeline from her service. Turned her out, Pruett said, without a character, upon an hour's notice, sooner than be thought to harbour a schemer under her roof and lose the annuity that Augusta's family could withdraw at a word. So that was the whole of it, laid bare. Augusta had not merely meant to wound. She had meant to destroy, wholly and past mending, and she had built the engine of it with a nice cruelty, so that the very letter that blackened Adeline's name would also, through frightened old Mrs. Fenn, strip her of her place, her wage, her roof, and the last shred of protection a friendless woman owned. By nightfall Adeline Harkness would be without character, without employment, and without a single door in the county that would open to her. And she would be all these things precisely because she had let a duke walk her in a garden. The world would say she had aimed too high and been justly brought low. The world always did. Corbett stood with his coat half on and understood, coldly and completely, what Augusta Westbourne had done and why. He had danced with Adeline. He had gone to her side at the assembly when the county laughed, had answered a cruelty with the flat weight of his displeasure, had let it be seen that the most sought-after man in 3 counties preferred the quiet companion in the mended gown to the polished daughters paraded before him season upon season. Augusta had a niece to settle and a vanity the size of the county, and she had watched a woman with nothing take, without trying the one prize Augusta had schemed a decade to win, This was the answer to it. If she could not have Stonefield, she would make certain that the woman who might have it should be ruined so thoroughly that no honor on earth could raise her, and that the Duke, that proud and wounded man, would be given every reason his own history had taught him to believe the worst and turn away. And she had very nearly had that too. That was the thing he could not forgive, walking out into the wet morning with his jaw set, that for an hour she very nearly had. He rode to Mrs. Fenn's, and he was too late even for that small mercy. The house was shut against him, the frightened old woman would not come down, and a servant with red eyes told him at the door that Miss Harkness had gone already, on foot with her box not an hour since, and had left no direction because she had none to leave. She had gone quietly, the girl said, and had thanked the household one, and had wept for no one to see, and had told the girl only that she was not to blame herself for anything, that none of them were, that a person could not always help what she was made to do. And then she had picked up her box, which was not heavy, for she owned so little, and she had walked out into the lane in the direction of the mail road, and the girl did not know where. Corbett stood in the cold doorway and felt the ground he had thought so solid give way beneath him. He had thought, in the arrogance of his own consequence, that being the Duke of Stonefield was a kind of armor that extended over whatever he chose to shelter. He was learning, on a stranger's doorstep on a wet morning, that his consequence was worth precisely nothing to a woman it had just destroyed, that his very interest in her had been the knife, that the more he had shown he valued her, the more surely he had marked her for this. She had not sent to him. Of course she had not sent to him. To send to him would be to prove the letter true, to come running to the great man to be saved, to be exactly the schemer they had painted. She would rather walk out into the world with a box and no character than give them the satisfaction of watching her beg the Duke to mend what loving the Duke had broken. He understood her too well now to hope otherwise, and understanding her broke his heart clean across. He got what he could from the weeping servant, which was little, and he sent Pruett one way and rode himself the other, along the mail road in the greying afternoon, and he did not find her. The mail had passed at noon. A woman answering to her had taken an outside place on it. The ostler at the crossroads inn believed, though he would not swear, bound he thought for the northern towns where a person might be swallowed up and start again as no one, which was the only mercy the ruined were ever offered, and no mercy at all. By the time the light failed, Corbett was many miles from Stonefield on a strange road, with a lathered horse and no direction, and the whole apparatus of his rank and wealth and dreaded name rendered wholly, contemptibly useless. Somewhere ahead of him in the dark a woman he had let himself love was riding away from every cruelty the county could invent, alone in the cold, believing, he had no doubt, that the Duke who had walked with her in the garden had read the letter like all the rest and believed it like all the rest and let her go. And the worst of it, the thing that bent him over the pommel there in the failing light with a sound he had not made since he was 22, was that for 1 hour of that morning, God forgive him, she would have been right. The emeralds lay in Augusta Westbourne's open palm like a small green fire, and the whole of the assembly seemed to lean toward them, breath held, as though the jewels themselves might speak the verdict. Corbett stood at the edge of that circle and felt the years fall away beneath him, felt the floor of the Harcourt's long gallery tilt into another room, another season, another woman who had smiled at him with just such practiced sweetness, while she reached into his life to take what she wanted. Sabine had smiled so. Sabine had wept prettily and reached, and he had believed her until the believing had cost him the better part of a decade's trust. The memory rose now with the taste of old iron, and for one terrible breath it laid itself over Edeline Harkness like a shroud, and he thought so. So it was this after all. So even she. He hated himself for the thought before it had finished forming, but he could not stop it. That was the wound's cruelty. It did not ask his leave. You see how it is, Augusta was saying, turning the emeralds so the candlelight ran green along their facets, her voice pitched to carry to the farthest listener. One pities a person of Miss Harkness's circumstances. One extends the kindness of an invitation, and this is the return one is given. My mother's emeralds, gone from her own chamber not 1 hour past, and found, she let the pause do its work, in this creature's reticule. A sound went through the crowd, low and eager, the sound of well-bred people given permission to be cruel and meaning to take it fully. Corbett heard a woman near his shoulder murmur that she had always thought there was something sly in the Harkness girl, and another answer that poverty made thieves of the best of them. He heard it as if through water. His gaze had not moved from Edeline's face. She had not wept. That was the first thing that reached him through the fog of his own old dread. She had not wept, had not clutched, had not thrown herself upon the mercy of the room. She stood very straight in her plain grey gown, the one she had worn without apology among all that silk, and her chin was level, and her hands were still at her sides. Only her eyes betrayed her, and what was in them was not the flinching of the guilty but a deep and steady grief, the look of one watching a thing she loved be taken from her and knowing she had no coin to buy it back. He had seen guilt. He had built half his caution upon the study of it. This was not that, and with that certainty the shroud tore, and shame flooded in behind it, hot and total, that he had let it settle over her at all. Miss Harkness. His own voice surprised him, quiet, but the gallery quieted around it, for when the Duke of Stonefield spoke, rooms had long since learned to listen. Have you anything to say? Her eyes came to him. He braced for reproach, for the wounded question of why he, who had walked with her in the dusk and told her things he had told no one, should ask it as though her word were a thing in doubt. It did not come. She only looked at him a moment, and then she said evenly, "I did not take them, Your Grace. I have never in my life had the Westbourne emeralds in my hand until this moment, when they were shown to me in another's. A breath. I know how little my saying so is worth in such a room as this. But you asked, and I have answered you truly, and I will not dress it in tears to more pleasing." It was so entirely herself, that refusal to perform even her own innocence, that something in his chest turned over and would not right itself again. Sabine had wept. This woman stood in the wreck of her whole standing and would not so much as ask him to believe her, because to ask would be to flatter, and she had never once flattered him. She would say as much, of course, Augusta put in smoothly, and there was the smallest note of haste beneath the smoothness, a note Corbett's ear, sharpened by years of men trying to sell him things caught and held. A thief always denies, but the proof does not deny Your Grace. The reticule spoke plainly enough. Did it? Corbett said. He turned to her fully now, and he let the whole cold weight of his attention settle upon her, the attention that had unmade sharper creatures than Augusta Westbourne across baize tables and in panelled council rooms. She was too accustomed to being looked at with admiration to feel at once what it was to be looked at with study. "Tell me, Miss Westbourne," he said, "when your mother found the emeralds gone from her chamber, where did you first think to look? Why? Everywhere. We searched everywhere. And in all that everywhere you came directly to a guest's reticule, in a crowded gallery, and named its contents before the strings were drawn." He heard his own voice go very level, very quiet, the quiet he was told men had learned to fear. "You said, not a quarter-hour ago and before this company, and I recall your words for they were peculiar, you said, 'Search her reticule, the emeralds are within.' Not, 'Let us search her.' Not, 'I suspect her.' You knew the place. You knew the very place, Miss Westbourne, before any hand but yours had opened it." The colour went from Augusta's face in a single falling wave, and Corbett watched it go, and understood in that watching that he had her. Anyone might suppose, a reticule is where a woman would conceal. A woman might conceal a thing in 100 places about her person, he said. You did not name 100. You named one, and you named it right, and there is only one manner of knowing where a stone is hidden before the hiding place is opened, and that is to have hidden it oneself, or to have watched it hidden. How dare you? But it came thin now, without its earlier ring, and the crowd that had leaned to Augusta a moment past had begun, by some slow animal instinct, to lean away. How dare you take the part of a nobody, a portionless creature nobody will have, against the word of... Against the word. He said it softly, and it silenced her more surely than shouting would have. Yes, I find I will. And it was true, and the truth of it went through him like cold water and clean air together, for he had spent so long guarding the door of his own belief that he had half forgotten a man might simply choose to open it. He believed her. He had believed her from the moment her chin came level and stayed. All the rest, the emeralds, the deduction, the room, was only the labour of proving to others what he had already known in the single unguarded chamber of himself, The chamber she had walked into weeks ago without knocking and would not now be put out of. He might have left it there. The room had turned, that much was plain in every averted glance now falling upon Augusta rather than upon Adeline. But he had learned, at the cost of years, what it was to be believed too late and too little, and he would not have it rest on his word against Augusta's, one great name against another, with Adeline's honour the coin they gambled. He would have it proven past the reach of any drawing-room to unsay. Miss Westbourne came to the reticule directly, he said, lifting his voice now so that it filled the gallery to its cornices, because she knew what was in it. But a stone does not carry itself from a lady's chamber to a stranger's reticule. Some hand bore it. Miss Westbourne did not leave this gallery all the evening. I will say that much for her. I marked her here. So it was not her own hand. Whose then? The silence stretched. And into it, from the shadowed doorway where the servants stood ranged with their trays, there came a small movement, a girl in a maid's cap twisting her apron in both hands, her eyes enormous in a white face. Corbett had noticed her earlier without noticing, a lady's maid, the sort of near-invisible presence a man of his rank had been trained from birth to overlook. She had been weeping. She was weeping now. "Speak," he said, and gentled it, for she was frightened near to fainting, and terror made poor witnesses. "No harm will come to you for the truth. You have my word upon it, and my word, whatever else is said of me tonight, has never yet been broken. Only the truth." "Whose hand?" The girl's mouth worked. She looked to Augusta, and away from Augusta as from a fire, and then she looked at Adeline Harkness standing wronged and steady in her grey gown, and something in that steadiness seemed to be the thing that undid her, for she began to speak in a rush, the words tumbling one upon another. "She bid me do it, your grace, Miss Westbourne. She give me the emeralds this evening and bid me slip them in the lady's bag when she set it by at the dancing, and I didn't want to, sir, I swear before God I didn't. But I've my place to keep and my mother to keep on it, and Miss Westbourne said she'd turn me off without a character, and see I never got another. And I done it, and I've been sick with it since. Miss Harkness never touched them. She never so much as saw them. It was me, because I was made to." She turned her streaming face upon Adeline. "Forgive me, miss. Oh, forgive me, I couldn't bear it, seeing you stand there." "There is nothing to forgive," Adeline said, and her voice was not steady now, but not for herself. "You were frightened, and you have been braver just now than the whole of this room. Do not weep. It is done, and you have undone it." That she should turn in the first moment of her own rescue, to comfort the very hand that had condemned her, Corbett felt it go into him like a blade turned slow. He had known women of great name and greater fortune do less kindness in a lifetime than she did in that breath, unthinking, with her own honour scarcely yet returned to her keeping. And he thought, standing there before the length of the assembled county, "I have been the greatest fool in 3 kingdoms, to have looked so long for a false heart in her, that I nearly failed to see the truest one I shall ever meet." The gallery had found its voice again, but it was another voice entirely now, the low, ashamed, indignant murmur of a crowd rounding upon the one it had lately cheered. The very woman who had said there was something sly in the Harkness girl was now heard to say she had never trusted Augusta Westbourne, not for a moment, that there was always something hard about the eyes. Corbett marked how quickly the tide could turn and felt no warmth toward those who turned with it. They had been ready enough to drown Adeline a quarter-hour past. But he let them talk, for their talk was the very engine that would carry this night's truth into every parlour in the county by morning, and he meant Adeline vindicated in every one of them. Augusta stood alone. Her allies had drawn their skirts aside from her by inches, in that small merciless choreography of a company disowning one of its own. Her mother had gone the colour of tallow and would not look at her. She made one last cast. "The girl lies, she is a servant, she will say anything." But it fell into the room and died there, for the room had decided, and there is nothing on earth so pitiless as fashionable people who have discovered the wind has changed. "You will return the emeralds to your mother," Corbett said to her, and there was no cruelty in it, only a finality colder than cruelty. "And you will make your apology to Miss Harkness before this company, or you will make it to no company at all. For I promise you that whatever house opens its doors to you after tonight will open them to nothing but talk of this. That is all the harm I will do you, Miss Westbourne. It is more than enough. You have done the rest yourself." She did not apologize. She gathered the ruin of her composure and swept from the gallery with her chin high and her face white, and the crowd parted before her and closed behind her and forgot her almost before the doors had shut, which was, Corbett thought, the completest punishment the world could have devised, and none of his making. Then he turned back, and the gallery turned with him, and he found that every eye in that great bright room had come to rest upon Edeline Harkness, but no longer as upon a spectacle, no longer as upon a thing to be judged and found wanting. They looked at her as one looks at a person who has stood in fire and not burned, and the looking had wonder in it, and the first grudging shape of respect. She stood in the center of all that attention as she had stood in her own condemnation, without triumph, without display, only that same level dignity that had caught at him across a crowded floor on the first night, and had not once let him go since, and Corbett, Duke of Stonefield, who had held himself apart from every drawing-room in the realm for the better part of 10 years, who had let it be said of him that he was cold, and would never marry, and cared for nothing but his acres and his horses. Corbett found that his feet had carried him forward without his leave, out of the safety of the room's edge and into its bright center, into the full sight of the assembled county, to stand before her where all the world might see. "Miss Harkness," he said, and he heard his own voice unsteady and did not care who marked it. "Edeline, I owe you more than an apology, though I owe you that first and fully. For one breath tonight, one breath, and I will carry the shame of it. I let an old wound whisper to me that you might be false, when everything I have known of you since the evening we met has told me you are the one wholly true thing I have found in a false and flattering world. I let them make me doubt you. I will not do it again while I live." A silence had fallen so complete that he could hear the candles. "You never once tried to be anything to me but yourself," he went on lower now, "for her and not for them, though they strained to hear, and he let them. You did not soften your tongue for my rank, nor angle for my notice, nor weep to win my pity when weeping would have served you. Tonight you stood to lose everything and would not so much as ask me to believe you, because asking would have been a kind of flattery, and you have never flattered me. Do you know what that is, to a man who has been flattered his whole life by people who wanted his name and never once his heart? Do you know what you are?" Her lips parted. Her composure, which had held through cruelty and accusation and rescue, wavered at last before this, and her eyes filled, and she said, barely above a breath, "Your Grace, Corbett, you must not here, not for their eyes. I could not bear it if it were only that you pitied me, or thought to shield me. Pity." He almost laughed, and the sound came ragged. "You still think it possible to pity you? Edeline, I have not pitied you for a single instant. I have envied every soul who spoke with you before I did. I have lain awake in a house with 200 rooms and thought of nothing but the plainest dressed woman in the county, and the way she says exactly what she means. That is not pity. I have not the smallest idea how to say to you plainly what it is, for I have not said it to a living soul in 10 years and thought I never should again." And there, before the whole of the assembly, with the wound of the evening still raw in the air and the truth of her honor ringing in every ear, the words rose in him past the last of his long guard. But even as they came, he saw her draw a sharp breath and press her hand to her lips, saw the tears break at last down her steady face, and saw too that it was too much, too sudden, too naked for her to receive standing in the gaze of the very people who had torn at her, saw her turn, overcome, and gather her plain grey skirts and move quickly toward the tall doors and the dark garden beyond, not in flight from him, but from all of them, from the unbearable brightness of being wanted allowed in the place she had been despised. For half a heartbeat the old Corbett, the guarded one, might have let her go, might have thought it wiser, might have counted the watching eyes. That Corbett was gone. He did not count them. He was already moving through the parting crowd, past the astonished faces, past Lady Harcourt's open mouth and the whispering fans, out of the light and toward the door through which she had vanished, his heart hammering a single word with every stride, unwilling now, after everything, to let one more moment pass with her thinking herself anything less than chosen. The length of the assembly room had never seemed so great to him. Corbett had crossed it 100 times with the unhurried gait of a man who knew that every door in the county would open at his approach, and never once had he felt the floor stretch beneath him like this. The polished boards running on, the candlelight swimming, the crowd parting before him not out of deference now, but out of plain astonishment, because the Duke of Stonefield was walking quickly, and no one in the room had ever seen him walk quickly toward anything in his life. Adeline stood near the tall windows at the far end, where she had gone to be out of the way, as she had always gone to be out of the way, and the shawl she had mended so carefully was drawn close about her shoulders as though she meant to make herself smaller still. She had heard the truth spoken aloud only moments before, heard Augusta Westbourne's cruelty turned inside out for all the room to see, and she had not gloated, had not lifted her chin in triumph, had only grown very pale and very still. And that stillness was what drew him on faster than any triumph could have. He knew that stillness. It was the stillness of a person bracing to be disappointed even now, even after everything, because she had been disappointed so many times that hope had become a thing she no longer trusted to hold her weight. "Miss Harkness," he said, and his voice came out lower and less steady than he had intended, and he did not care. "I would speak with you, before all of them. I find I can no longer bear to do it any other way." Around them the murmur rose and then hushed, the whole glittering assembly leaning in like a field of wheat bent by one wind. He was aware of Augusta somewhere at the edge of his vision, her painted composure cracked, her mother clutching at her sleeve. He was aware of the matrons who had spent the evening tallying Adeline's plain gown and her want of fortune, of the young bucks who had laughed behind their gloves. Let them lean in, let them hear every word. He had spent his whole life guarding his heart behind a wall so high that men called him cold and thought it wisdom, and the wall had kept him safe and kept him alone, and tonight he had nearly let it keep him from the only good thing that had ever tried to reach him over it. "Your Grace," Adeline said quietly, "you owe me nothing. You defended me tonight when it cost you a great deal, and that is more than I had any right to expect. You need not." Her breath caught, and she steadied it with visible effort. "You need not make a spectacle of your kindness. I would not have you laughed at on my account. Say what you must and let me go home." Home. He almost smiled at the word, and there was something raw in it. "You would go back to that cold little house, and the cousin who counts every candle you burn, and you would tell yourself that this was a fine evening, because for once the cruelty was named for what it is, and tomorrow you would rise and be dignified and be alone. Is that the whole of what you want, Miss Harkness, to bear it well?" Her eyes came up to his, and he saw the sting land, saw that he had spoken too near the bone. "It is what I have," she said. "One learns to want what one has." "No," he said, "you never learn that. I have watched you these weeks. You want a great deal. You want the world to be kinder than it is, and you want people to be better than they show themselves. And you keep on wanting it even when they give you every reason to stop. That is not a woman who has learned to want less. That is the bravest wanting I have ever seen." He stopped and swallowed and made himself say the thing he had never said to any living soul. "It shamed me. It shames me still. I have wanted less for years because I was afraid, and I called my fear discernment, and I let it make me hard." The room was utterly silent now. He heard his own heart. He went on. "You know something of why," he said, more gently, for her alone though the whole assembly strained to catch it. "You have guessed, I think, though you were too kind to ask. There was a woman, once, who let me believe she loved the man, and loved only the title he wore. When she showed her true face, I told myself I had learned a lesson worth the wound, that affection offered to a duke is always a purse held open, and that the safest course was trust no warmth at all. For a dozen years I lived by that lesson. It made me feared. It made me admired. It made me, God help me, exactly the sort of man she had wanted, a fortune with a face." He drew a breath. "And then you came, and you would not flatter me, and you would not angle for me, and you looked at me across that first crowded room as though a dukedom were a rather tiresome thing to be saddled with, and I did not know what to do with you. I still do not. I only know that a few hours ago I very nearly let you be destroyed rather than risk my own heart, and I have never in my life been so ashamed of anything I have done." Corbett. His given name broke from her without her leave. He saw her realize it and saw her not take it back, and something in his chest that had been clenched for 12 years came loose all at once. "You cannot say these things here. You will regret them by morning. A man of your rank and a woman of mine. I have thought of nothing else but rank for 12 years, he said, and it has bought me a very fine house full of very quiet rooms. I am done with it. Adeline. He said her name the way a man says a word he has been holding in his mouth for weeks, tasting it. I am not offering you rescue. You have never once as though you wanted rescuing, and I love you the more for it. I am offering you a man who has been a coward and would like, with the rest of his life, to learn to be brave the way you are brave. That is all I have that is worth anything. The rest, the title, the estates, the whole weary inheritance, you may take it or leave it in the road. It is nothing to me beside the plain fact of you. He watched her face and did not breathe. He had faced down duelists and creditors and a father's temper and the whole cutting machinery of society, and none of it had cost him what it cost to stand there with his hands open and nothing left to guard himself with. He heard, distantly, the small commotion of Augusta's mother steering her daughter toward the doors, the rustle of skirts making for the safety of a waiting carriage, and he did not turn his head. There would be no more mischief from that quarter tonight, nor for many nights to come. A girl who has staked her whole standing on the ruin of another and been caught at it does not soon show her face again in a county that has seen it done. He let them go. His whole attention was one small thing at the far end of a long room, and it was worth more to him than the good opinion of every soul who had ever flattered his rank. I do not want your estates, Adeline said at last, and her voice shook, and she let it shake. I have never wanted them. I want, she pressed her lips together, and when she spoke again the words came steadier, truer, as though she had decided to be as brave as he had asked. I want the man who sat with me in the library and argued about the wretched poets and did not once try to impress me. I want the man who noticed I had mended my own gloves and said nothing to shame me and everything to comfort me. I want you, Corbett, and I have been so frightened of wanting you, because a woman like me does not get to keep a thing like that, and I did not know how I should bear the losing of it. Then do not lose it, he said. Keep it. Keep me, I am asking you, before every soul in this room who has ever thought you beneath their notice, to be my wife, not because I would raise you, for you were never low, but because you have already raised me further than my whole title ever could. Will you have me? For a moment she could not answer, and he thought his heart would stop with the waiting. And then she laughed, a small, wet, astonished laugh, the laugh of a woman who has stopped bracing for the blow, because the blow has turned into an embrace, and she put out her hand. That plain ungloved hand with the little scar across the knuckle where she had once caught it on a broken latch, and he took it in both of his as though it were the only warm thing in a cold country. I will have you, she said. God forgive me my presumption, I will. He raised her hand to his lips, there in the full glare of the candlelight, and the assembly seemed to let out one long breath together, and then, because he was a duke and had spent his life under standing rooms even when he despised them, he did not turn away into private tenderness. He kept her hand in his and turned them both to face the assembly, so that every matron and every mother and every young man who had laughed might see plainly whom the most sought-after man in the county had chosen, and see also that he was not ashamed but proud. Prouder than he had ever been of anything his name had won him. Augusta Westbourne stood white and rigid by the card tables, and for one moment he met her eyes. He had thought, walking across that long floor, that he would want to see her humbled, that some part of the old hardness would savour it. He found that he did not. She had been exposed by her own hand and her own lies, and there was nothing left in her worth the trouble of triumph, only a small and shrinking figure who had staked everything on the belief that cruelty was cleverness and had lost. He inclined his head to her with cold courtesy, the courtesy one shows a defeated thing one intends never to think of again, and he saw the last of her hauteur crumble under it. That was punishment enough. He turned his attention where it belonged. Lady Penrose, he said, addressing the old dowager whose approval had for 40 years been the whole coin of the county, and whose disapproval had earlier in the evening helped light the fire under Adeline. You will oblige me by receiving the future Duchess of Stonefield. I should take it as a particular kindness. It was not a request, and every soul present knew it was not, and the old woman, who was cruel but never stupid, rose to the occasion with the swiftness of long practice, sweeping toward Adeline with her hands out and a smile arranged upon her face. So that the very tide of society which had that morning left Adeline stranded now came rushing to lift her up. Corbett watched it with a dry and knowing eye. He had no illusion that they had grown kind. They had only grown prudent, as such people always did, and it did not matter in the least, because Adeline would never again stand alone by a window at the far end of any room as long as he drew breath, and that was the only thing he had set out to accomplish. Later, much later, when the fiddlers had been persuaded to strike up again, and the room had recovered its noise, and the great news was already galloping toward every drawing-room in the Shire, he drew her out through the tall windows onto the stone terrace, where the night air was cool and smelled of box hedge and coming rain, and where, for a blessed moment, there were only the two of them and the dark garden falling away below. "You are certain," he said. It was not quite a question. He had asked it of himself 100 times in the last hour and could not stop asking it of her. "You understand what you take on. They will watch you, they will look for you to fail, and some of them will hope for it. It is not an easy thing to be my wife. I would not have you walk into it blind for love of me." "I have been watched all my life," Adeline said, "by people who hoped for me to fail, and I did not fail, and I had none of you to stand beside me while I did not." She turned to him in the half-dark, and he could just see the shape of her face, the steadiness of it. "I am not afraid of them, Corbett. I was only ever afraid of one thing, that I should let myself hope for you and be wrong. You have seen to it that I was not wrong. Everything after that is only weather." "And your cousin," he said, for he had not forgotten the cold house and the counted candles, "shall count nothing of yours again. You will send for whatever you wish to keep and leave the rest, and you will never sleep another night under a roof that grudged you the warming of it." "I have a great many rooms, Adeline, and every one of them has been waiting years for someone to make it worth the keeping." She gave a small unsteady laugh at that, and he pressed on, because it eased something in him to say the practical things aloud, to build with plain words the safe place he meant to give her. "There is a garden at Stonefield gone half to ruin for want of anyone who cared to walk in it. I think you would set it right. I think you would set a great many things right, and I mean to stand by and watch you do it, and be quietly amazed as I have been from the first." He laughed low and unguarded, a sound he scarcely recognized as his own. "Only whether," he repeated. "You will unmake me entirely, you know. I shall become one of those doting husbands that men pity at their clubs. I shall try to leave you a little dignity," she said gravely, for appearances, and he heard the smile in it, and the teasing warmth that undone him from the very first, and he could not help himself. He lifted his hand and touched her cheek, only that, the backs of his fingers against her cool skin, and she leaned into it the smallest degree, and it was more than all the practiced conquests of his careless years put together. "I have something of yours," he said quietly, and reached into his coat and drew out a thing she had lost weeks ago and never expected to see again, a small worn book of verse, her mother's, that Augusta's set had once snatched from her and mocked and left, they thought, forgotten in a window seat. He had found it. He had kept it. He had carried it against his breast every day since, though he had not admitted to himself why. He pressed it into her hands now and closed her fingers over it. "I could not give it back before. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment. The truth is I was waiting until I had the courage to give you my whole self along with it, and I was a long time finding it, and I am sorry for every hour of the delay." She held the little book, and he watched her understand what it meant that he had kept it, and he saw her eyes shine in the dark, and she did not trust herself to speak. She did not need to. He had spent his life reading silences for the danger in them. Hers at last held no danger at all, only a fullness too great for words, and he found that he could read that too. "Come inside," he said gently, tucking her hand into the crook of his arm as though it had always belonged there, as though the last 12 guarded years had only been the long waiting for this. "Let them see us. Let the whole county see us, and let them make of it what they will. I have hidden my heart so long I have quite lost the knack of it, and I do not mean to learn it again." They went in together through the tall windows, out of the cool dark and into the light and the music, and the room turned toward them, and this time Adeline did not shrink from the turning. She walked at his side with her chin level and her mother's book of verse held against her breast. Corbett, Duke of Stonefield, feared, admired, and for so long so terribly alone, looked down at the plain, dignified, dauntless woman that all of them had overlooked and he alone had truly seen, and thought that he had never in his life understood the worth of anything until he understood the worth of her. The candlelight was warm upon them both, the fiddles played, and he held her hand as though he would never again let it go, and for the rest of his days he never did.